listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana Cristofero, and produced by Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Hey listeners, some of you have asked how you can best support this show. So I've got two things you can do. One, you can leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or wherever you listen really. Two, you can donate to the show and to Dougy Center by heading to dougy.org/griefoutloud and then scroll down to the green donate button. So thanks for asking how you can help. This episode is the second in our series focused on grieving the death of a friend. In the first one, I talked with Mel and Annette about their friend Amy. If you missed it, be sure to go check it out. In this one, I talked with the writer Lissa Soep about her latest book, Other People's Words, Friendship, Loss, and the Conversations That Never End. Have you ever heard someone's voice in your head and in a moment you're transported to a time and place when you were with them? Or maybe you heard their voice come through in a story someone else is telling, and wham, it feels like that person is now in the room with both of you. It's this exact experience that Lissa explores in Other People's Words, writing about her friends Christine and Jonnie, and how their words live on after they died. Jonnie in a tragic swimming accident, and Christine after a long degenerative illness. One that ended up taking her words from her before she died. In her grief over these two losses, Lissa turned to the Russian critic Mikhail Bahktain's theory of double voicing, the way that words and language keep people with us, and our own speech and the speech of those who knew them. Lissa is a senior editor for audio at Vox Media and special projects producer and senior scholar in residence at YR Media. She has a PhD from Stanford, where she first started writing about Bakhtin. Okay, here's my conversation with Lissa. Lissa, thank you for joining me for Grief Out Loud today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking a lot about your book, Other People's Words, and the people that you wrote about in that book. And so I wonder what would you like us to know about your friends, Jonnie and Christine?
Thank you so much for asking and for having me on the show and for having conversations about friendship and grief and loss and love. It's such a powerful conversation. I'm glad to be a part of it. Glad to listen to the other folks that you're bringing on as well. So Jonnie and Christine, I'll start with Jonnie. I became friends with Jonnie through his partner, Emily. And when we were quite young, I was friendly with Emily from my college years. She was the cousin of my roommate. And then we got really close in those couple of years after college when everything is new and you're figuring yourself out and what your life might look like. And Emily was close to me in that process when we were both living on the East Coast. And then I moved to the Bay Area, to the San Francisco Bay Area, and pretty soon Emily came here too. This was some years after college, and by that point, she was together with Jonnie. Jonnie, well, first of all, has bright orange hair, had bright orange hair. That is just a trait of his that is immediately visually apparent and makes him stand out in lots of crowds. And, Jonnie stood out in lots of crowds for other reasons. His laugh, he had a riotous laugh that everybody who knew him will reference, both when he was alive and after he was gone. And I think what the laugh said about him and created around him in his life was just a fearlessness about being present in the world and saying what he needed to say and just hoovering in experiences. Jonnie was game. He was game for life. It was like he was a friend for whom I would sometimes find myself asking, what haven't you done? And I tend to be a kind of more fear governed person. So it was always like a curiosity to me that like any conversation I would have, Jonnie would be like, then have some story he could spin out of, he spent a year like walking across the country for nuclear disarmament, and he'd been a part of early activism around AIDS in the ACT UP movement as it was getting off the ground in California. And he had such strong convictions about his belief. He spent time as an anarchist, but then he went to business school at MIT and got a really square and straight-laced job, and yet he was always kind of wild and yet also tender. And I think that's something that I just have never really found in anyone else in my life since Jonnie was gone. But when I find other people who have hints of that combination, I always turn to Chaz, my husband, or to other people if I'm with them who knew Jonnie, and I'll be like, they remind me of Jonnie. Just this mix of like out loud, fearless, expansive way of living, a sweet, tender warmth and expressiveness of his love. And I felt that love. And then I also witnessed that love with his relationships to Emily and to their two kids, Max and Sadie. And so I would say, just a kind of a story that maybe helps to bring out that moment was at Jonnie's memorial. There were people at his memorial whom he knew from his present day workplace who were in their khakis and their button-down shirts and their blazers. And they were looking around and they were like, who are all these like hippies? Or was I don't, like, and then there would be the anarchists who knew Jonnie from back in those days of his life. And they would see these other Boston real estate agent or, the people who Jonnie knew from his workplace. And at the same time that everybody, I think, was puzzled by the fact that each of these groups of people and everyone in between felt so close to Jonnie. They were surprised in that, but then it wasn't that surprising because that's kind of who he was. He drew people to him, and he was radically non-judgmental, even as he was like a fighter for justice and free expression and love. So anyway, that's a lot about Jonnie. Christine, I also met through Christine's partner, Mercy. Mercy and I were in a grad school class together the very first year that I was studying. I was working on a PhD in education. And I spotted her across the room, and a combination of just her presence and then what she started to say very quickly. She was very vocal in class. I just knew I wanted to be her friend. And, I don't know if that's ever happened to you before, but you just kind of sense it. There's just a draw. And I think it operated on many levels for me at that point. I was drawn to her in lots and lots of ways. And soon, we kind of maneuvered around each other and got to talking and started spending some time together outside of class. And then very soon after that, she told me about Christine, and this was her partner who they'd only been together a couple of years at this point. And Christine had come with her, taken sabbatical from the school where they taught together, and so that they could spend this year that Mercy was going to get a graduate degree, and Christine would get to come along and be a part of that. And so very, soon after Mercy and I met was my birthday, and Mercy said we should all get together and Christine would come. Christine was 20 years older than Mercy and I are, and also Chaz, who I was already dating at the time, my boyfriend, who I'm now married to. She always had this kind of like silver-haired mystery. It was like a novelty at that time. We were in our mid-20s to have a friend who was in her 40s. And so she had a lot of life that she had lived by the time I got to know her. And I think that did give her I held her in a kind of esteem that was unlike people who were the same age as I was, because I knew, and she shared experiences that she had had before I was born that made her who she was. And yet she was a little bit ageless, and our friendship formed in that one year that we were all together in the Bay and really became like a four-way great love of our lives that took hold then and continued for years and years after Mercy and Christine went back to the East Coast to resume teaching. And then our friendship converted to a lot of writing as a kind of mechanism to stay close. And that was largely kind of inspired by and driven by Christine's kind of old-fashioned ways of writing letters. She was just a believer in longhand correspondence and had a ritual of writing every night after dinner. She would comment on student papers, and she wrote poetry, and she would write to Mercy, and she would write to the person at school who pissed her off, or the politician in her community who'd done something she disagreed with. And then she would write to me, and she would write to Chaz, and sometimes, tell me what she was reading, tell me what was happening at school, find out what was happening with me. So it was just a constant flow of communication that was kind of mediated through the written word.
Mm. As you're talking about both Jonnie and Christine, Lissa, what comes through is just this like deep admiration and maybe a little bit of awestruckness at both of them being so big personalities, maybe in very different ways. And I was also reflecting that, sometimes when you have couple friends, right, you like meet a couple as a couple, or one person, another person comes into they start dating someone. And it seems like and for you, there was a way that you had individual relationships with both Jonnie and Christine in the context of being originally friends with Mercy and Emily.
Absolutely. And same like with Chaz, that there, and I think I wonder if there's like a critical period in our lives developmentally when we're young where it's easier for that to happen. I don't know, but I just felt like it was a time in my life. I became friends with both of them in my 20s when everything was sort of just brimming with possibility, and intimacies were very fluid and crisscrossy, and there was just an immediacy and urgency to those relationships, feeling like we are the people that one another will be, like discovering ourselves through. And so, yeah, absolutely, that's true. And I think Christine remarked on that. She performed the wedding ceremony for Chaz and me when we got married in our backyard in San Francisco. And that was one of the things that she talked about, this just kind of like, ricocheting of connection that would happen among us. So I think that's right, what you're noticing.
And then Jonnie and Christine died in such different ways.
Yeah.
And when my work with people, sometimes folks who've had someone die really suddenly will be a little envious of people who had someone die over a long-term illness. And people who've had someone die for a long-term illness sometimes are envious of the people who had someone die really suddenly for a variety of different reasons. And in the end, they come to a conclusion like it all is terrible and really we shouldn't be envious of each other. And, for you having had both of those experiences, I wonder how each of them died what did that mean for you?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't die exactly at the same time, but it was close enough that I was very keenly aware of what it meant for me, and maybe even more so what it meant for the immediate beloved people that Jonnie and Christine left behind, the circumstances of their deaths. So, Jonnie died in an accident. He was in Montana with Emily and his small children at the time for already a tragic reason. Emily's stepfather, whom she'd been very close to, was hiking on a mountain in Montana, and he fell and he didn't survive the fall. And so Emily and Jonnie and the kids flew out to Montana to gather with their loved ones. And Jonnie was training for a triathlon and was swimming in the lake and was run over by a boat that had been speeding by. I got a call from a mutual, really close friend of ours, and that's how I found out that Jonnie had died. And it was just, utter shock and immediate, sense of desperation to be some kind of support for Emily and the kids and what they were going through. And I also am close with Jonnie's sister. And so it was just, an utter state of being unprepared for anything like that. Christine, it was very different. So Christine, over a period of time, started to behave in ways that were kind of perplexing. But it was, in part because she was 20 years older than the rest of us. I think we weren't sure what was going on, and we came up with different explanations. Maybe she was going through menopause. Maybe this is just what it looks like to be not in your 20s and 30s, which we didn't know as closely because that's where we were, and ultimately in our early 40s. And she started to kind of withdraw from Mercy in ways that were really dismaying and upsetting to Mercy. And she lost she lost a cat whom she adored. And she really, really, really struggled with the loss of this beloved pet. And it started to, that made a lot of sense. And yet it sort of lingered in ways that Mercy had a hard time understanding. And over time, the change in Christine became enough of a factor in their intimacy that Mercy ended up becoming involved with somebody else, and their relationship came to an end. And that was devastating, obviously, for Mercy and Christine. And also when you have a four-way friendship like the one that we shared, I don't know if you've ever gone through anything like that, when you have this other pairing that feels so much a part of your love and family, and then there's a rupture between them, and you're sort of left with your own kind of feelings of betrayal. Like, wait, we were in this together. We were all gonna do life together. And this all happened without any awareness on our part that there was something else going on with Christine. And it went on for a long time, more than a year like that, where Christine's behavior became more and more, hard to understand. And yet I thought it was heartbreak. And her writing changed in initially kind of subtle ways, and then more and more kind of stark ways. And she started behaving at work in ways that were also not okay in that workplace where she was responsible for things that she wasn't coming through on, which was utterly unprecedented for her as a teacher of enormous respect and skill. And then finally, after a series of incidents, we realized that what I had been interpreting as heartbreak over the loss of Mercy was in fact an underlying condition of cognitive decline, which eventually had a diagnosis of dementia. So she, it was an experience of misunderstanding for a very long time what was happening with this person I loved. And then deep into that process, having a different frame and name for it, and needing to sort of reconfigure my own relationship to her and the dynamic among the four of us, as the dementia continued to, take hold in her speech and in her ways of communicating and her ways of thinking and being in the world.
Was there a way in which finally getting some sort of diagnosis for these pretty drastic changes in Christine's behavior, was there a way in which that shifted how you've related to her versus when it was like the grief of the ending of the four-way kind of connection friendship?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we were really young and she was young, to have that kind of diagnosis. So I think just having a name for it didn't immediately produce a playbook of how to feel or how to be. And I think it was especially profound because so much of how we had related to one another up until this point was through speech, and specifically the written word, and our relationship to books that we read. We sort of lived through these stories, our own stories, and the ones that we kind of inhabited through other people's stories that we consumed together and talked about. And so one of the ways that I, over time in writing this book, really connected to my love for Christine was re-experiencing her words in all of their forms, from prior to and through and after this illness got a name, and to notice the tremendous will to express and capacity to express in Christine that marked that entire arc of her life, including the very end when she had almost no words left. And yet I still felt this incredibly strong presence of her voice and her language. And part of that was in memory of what she had said before, and that being so indelible to me. Part of that was in what she continued to express in the words that remained and in the letters that she still wrote and eventually moved to text, that by the end bore very little resemblance to how she had communicated in the past, and yet it was full of her voice and life, and even kind of relics and artifacts of poetry that she had written and read in earlier times of her life that sort of made its way through to the very end of how she spoke and what she had to say. And then once she was gone, I think going back and sort of looking at this essentially like archive of her life in words is part of what inspired me to write this book.
One of the things that really came through in your book is the way that you do have just like a direct representation of the texts and the emails that you got from Christine, and, being able to see and witness, as a reader, the shift in her communication.
Mm-hmm.
But wow, her ability to communicate so much through 3 exclamation points was kind of shocking to me. I was like, I don't even know this person, and I can just feel what's coming through from just 3 exclamation points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, punctuation is kind of this unexpected like element in the story, because in earlier times in Christine's life, she wrote with terrific restraint. I'd be hard pressed to find a single exclamation point in anything she'd written before, certainly not 5 or 6 in a row. And then over time, as her writing changed, punctuation started to sort of show up as this really prominent texture, as her sentences would sort of drop off, and then there would be like dot 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 of periods or exclamation points or rows of question marks. Instead of those feeling empty, they felt again like they were brimming. They were like filled with the unsaid. They opened space for me to imagine and to feel a connection to her, that didn't necessarily have to take the shape of words. And then there's this other beautiful punctuation element or motif that showed up in the book because it shows up on Mercy's body, which is a tattoo that Mercy has, that was inspired by a student in one of her classes. Mercy had given an assignment to design a punctuation mark that doesn't exist, and he drew this picture that was it was a mark that basically promised that no matter how much time it takes for a message that I am committing to the page in a letter, no matter how long it takes that letter to reach from me to you, that feeling that I'm expressing will remain. So it's a kind of covenant of a sort of everlasting truth in what it is that you've committed to the page. And so Mercy loved that idea so much that she made it a tattoo on her arm. And I close the book with that image because I think so much of this book and my reflections on friendship and loss is about what remains even in change and even after we've had to let somebody go.
It's like a vow of punctuation.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, the book, Other People's Words. Like how did you come to the place of being able to write it, and kind of why now in the process of grieving for both Jonnie and Christine?
Yeah. I mean, I started writing it a long time ago. It's taken me about 8 or 9 years to write this book. And it was inspired by, I think, the fact that these losses happened around the same time. And like you said, in such different ways. And so I was so struck in both of these relationships and dynamics about the ways in which we lose loved ones and then find them again and again through language, and often by carrying other people's language within our own. So we keep hearing from the people we love, and sometimes we hear it because we're actually speaking in ways that are phrases they have said or intonations that sneak up on us and remind us of somebody that we love. And so as I was processing these losses in such personal ways, my mind went to this unexpected place, which was a philosophy of language that I had studied actually in that grad school class where I met Mercy. And it was the sort of theories and ideas of a Russian philosopher of language and critic of literature named Mikhail Bahktain. And so I actually got the title of the book from a phrase from Bakhtin, which is that he believed that and argued that our speech is filled to overflowing with other people's words. So that's where other people's words comes from, is this notion that, conversation and dialogue don't only happen between people, it happens within people. And our own voices are produced from the words of others, right? We don't get our words from a dictionary. We don't produce them spontaneously from within ourselves. They're products of the relationships that we have and the histories that have shaped who we are and how language emerges for us and flows from our mouths into the world. And so I found some of those ideas strangely consoling as I was experiencing these losses, and I was making sense of how it was that I continued to relate to the voices of Jonnie and Christine, even when those voices were no longer here in the world with us in real time. One of the ways that it came out for me with Jonnie was actually Emily sharing with me voicemails that she had saved from Jonnie once he had died, and she knew that she was going to need any recording of his voice that she could hold on to for the rest of her life to form conversations with him for herself and her kids. And so she has a file on her computer that has just all of these voicemails, and each one starts the same way. It always starts with "Dear Sugar," which is what Jonnie called Emily, "Dear Sugar," like, "I'll be home a little late. Dear Sugar, just checking in on you. Dear Sugar, I wish I were there. Dear Sugar, getting Max out of the bath." And when I listened back to those recordings that Emily so generously and trustingly shared with me, and we listened to them together, I felt like I could hear Jonnie in two dimensions. And Bakhtin's word for that is double voicing, that we can speak in two languages or two time periods at the same time. And I was hearing sort of the Jonnie from before, when he was living his life and calling Emily, checking in on the kids. And then the Jonnie of now, the sort of the Jonnie that sort of transcended and continued to speak and reach out even after he was gone. And that, again, that's the sort of richness of that possibility. It doesn't remove the pain of loss, and it doesn't fill the absence, but it gives us something to tune into that maybe can provide some kind of solace. And so that kind of planted a seed for me about what this story might be able to do. And then for Christine, in the very end of her life, when like I said, she only had a couple of words left, and Mercy called and said, "If you want to see her again, you need to come now." And Chaz and I, figured out stuff for our kids and hustled our way across the country. And this was where I was saying to you, this feeling of both the sadness of the silence that remained around Christine, but also this feeling of the space like teeming with language and teeming with her voice. Whether it was me speaking both sides of our conversation or just a sense of kind of the flooding in of all the words that had ever been spoken between us. And that was another moment where I was like, what is this? What is this feeling? And is there a way to make sense of it? And more Bakhtin and his ideas about double voicing and about our speech, flowing with other people's words, felt like something that maybe I could kind of hang a narrative on.
You write so illustratively. That's a word. Yes, you illustrate well with your words that concept of double voicing and the way that Christine and Jonnie kind of continued to come through to you in their words and the words of other people that were reflecting of their words. And I'm wondering if there's any like recent stories or examples of ways that their words have come through to you.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I mean, I've been working on the book, so I'm sort of
In it.
re-experiencing them all the time. And it's interesting, well, I can share one sort of personal story. This is not very recent. This is some years ago. There was a time in my relationship with Chaz where we were going through a really hard time together, and our anniversary was coming up, and I was a little bit at a loss for words to find what I needed to say in some kind of a card to him, because we were struggling. And the words that came to me were Christine's, because Christine, as I said, officiated our wedding, and she was unsentimental. She also was really literary, as I mentioned. So she used a lot of Virginia Woolf in our wedding ceremony. And citing Virginia Woolf, she had these lines when she married us that she said, I should have written them down, so I had them in front of me, but she said something along the lines of, there will be times of wounding and the necessity for healing. In family, there will be doubt. No, in family, there will be discord. In conversation, there will be the unspoken. It is good to be humble about all of this, humble about failings in others and in ourselves. Those words were brave to say under a chuppah on a wedding day when everybody only wants to hear about the good stuff. And yet that was Christine, doing what we had asked, finding language to make this moment meaningful. And little did I know at the time how much I would need those words later in life when those realities take root, inevitably, as they will in one form or another. And Christine's words were the ones that sort of, helped to give me some kind of clarity at that moment when I needed it.
Lissa, as we come sort of to the end of our time together today, what through these experiences have you learned about how to support other people in their grief?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a specific moment with Emily. Maybe I can answer that way. And it's actually not anything that I did especially skillfully in supporting loved ones who are in that acute experience of grieving somebody around whom they've built their entire lives, which was Emily's case. But it's something that I witnessed and she told me about, from another friend of hers who, who I've just never forgotten this story. So basically, it was about a year after Jonnie had died, and the two of them met up for brunch. And, they were just chit-chatting and catching up. And of course, the friend was asking how Emily was doing and how the kids were doing. And then she just turned to Emily at one point and she said, I've been meaning to ask you something else. How's Jonnie? And Emily just said, thank you. I think, as she's shared with me, if I'm understanding correctly, it just was recognizing an aspect of her experience that so many of us had missed or just hadn't thought to ask, just asking in the present tense, how is Jonnie? And it wasn't like because somehow she thinks Jonnie's still alive, or, it was just an opening up to the possibility that, there is a present tense in their intimacy and what they mean to each other, how they are communicating with each other, that doesn't end because he died. And there's just a radical open-heartedness in the question that I've always remembered and have wanted to think about other ways that we can be present for people who are in that acute, most intimate kind of grief by asking a question like that.
I love that. And I remember when I read that in the book, I was like, oh yeah, that's so important, of this idea that, and I hear people struggle with it all the time. Like they try to correct themselves with their tenses, particularly pretty early on after someone dies. Oh, my dad was, or my dad is, or was, or is, or was. And I'm like, both. Right. And to give that spaciousness and that permission for the ongoingness of the person, which I think you do so beautifully in your book, right? The ongoingness of Jonnie and Christine through their words and the ways that their words come to you through through memories, but or through other people or other ways that they continued to have a presence in your life. Well, Lissa, I just want to take a moment to offer some words of appreciation for your book, Other People's Words, which is now out, listeners, so you can go get a copy of it. And just what a grounding point it was of connecting with how meaningful friendship is, especially as adults and in that really formative time that you mentioned of our 20s and 30s, when we're discovering ourselves through our relationships with other people. So just really grateful that this book is out there so that other people who are grieving the death of a friend have some reflection of their experience. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I hope the book is an invitation to readers to sort of notice something in their language that they're doing all the time, and we just sometimes don't have a way of naming it and knowing it, which is sort of taking and carrying other people's words within our own, and sometimes that's friends where we hear ourselves say something exactly how they might have. Sometimes it's another kind of loved one, who you talk to your kid in a certain way and you're like, oh my God, that's my mother's voice suddenly is coming out of my mouth. Sometimes it's a therapist that you go see when you're a part of a couple, and suddenly that therapist's voice is a presence in your most intimate moment. So I hope that there's something in the book for people who are experiencing loss in friendship. And I hope that there's even something more expansive in the book around loss and how even within it, the voices of others are companions with us inside our words.
Well, I know I'm going to be paying closer attention because I always think of those times I'm like, oh, hello to whoever it is that just showed up. I'm like, hey, Grandma, thanks for, I needed that today. So.
I love that. Hello. That's literally that's literally what Bakhtain would call it. That's dialogic within you're actually having the dialogue inside your mind.
Well, I love it. I feel so academic in this moment. Well, Lissa, thank you for making time for this conversation. Wishing you so well with all that comes with promoting a book out in the world. And just thank you.
Thank you so much.
And listeners out there, I say it each and every time, but thank you for being part of the show, part of our community, for sharing episodes with people who might be interested in learning more about what we're talking about here. You can always reach out to me directly, griefoutloud@dougy.org, dougy.org. It's our main website. You can find information about our local programming, free downloadable resources, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Excited as always to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.